The cold of the marble floors seeped through the thin soles of her worn shoes, a familiar ache that mirrored the chill in her soul. For Ilara, every day was a battle fought in silence, a war waged against the gnawing hunger in her son's belly and the crushing invisibility of being human in an elven world. She was a ghost polishing the gilded cage of Silverwood Palace, her grief for a lost husband a constant, heavy shroud. The memory of his warmth was the only thing that stood between her and the abyss of despair. Her greatest fear wasn't the disdain in the Fae's ageless eyes, but the day her hands would be too raw, her body too weary, to provide even the meager scraps that kept her child alive. As she worked, a silent prayer formed on her lips, a desperate wish for a place of safety, a world away from this beautiful, cruel kingdom. Before we continue her journey, let us know who is sharing this moment with her. Comment your name, where you're watching from, and what time it is. And be sure to subscribe to the channel to follow her story. Her world was a map of endless corridors and echoing halls, each surface reflecting a distorted version of her own exhaustion. Ilara's existence was defined by the rhythmic scrape of her brush against stone and the sharp, floral scent of elven cleaning agents that never quite masked the smell of poverty clinging to her clothes. She moved through the palace like a phantom, her presence acknowledged only when a task was left undone. The elves, with their ethereal grace and casual cruelty, saw her not as a woman mourning a husband and raising a son, but as a necessary, if unpleasant, fixture. Her son, Finn, was the sun in her perpetually grey sky, his laughter the only melody that could drown out the whispers of contempt. For him, she endured the humiliation, the gnawing emptiness, and the bone-deep weariness. Her love for him was a fierce, protective fire in a world of ice, a shield against the slow, creeping death of hope. King Theron was more myth than man, a figure of remote, unyielding power who ruled from a throne of ancient Silverwood. Whispers followed him like his own shadow, and tales of a monarch as eternal and unchanging as the stars. From her lowly vantage point, Ilara saw only the cold perfection of his profile during state processions, the severe line of his jaw, and the weight of a crown that seemed forged from sorrow itself. The kingdom, for all its shimmering beauty, was decaying from within, its magic fading like a dying ember. The court physicians spoke in hushed tones of a deep malady afflicting the king, a wasting sickness that mirrored the land's blight. To Ilara and the other servants, he was a distant, terrifying force, the embodiment of the very power that kept her trapped. She could never imagine that beneath his stoic facade, a primal curse was slowly devouring him, twisting his soul into a feral beast. A tremor of unease rippled through the palace, a disquiet that was thicker than the usual morning mist rolling in from the whispering woods. The news spread not through official decree, but through the frantic, hushed conversations of courtiers and guards. King Theron had fallen, not in battle, but into a deep, impenetrable slumber, a cursed sleep from which none of his healers could wake him. He had been moved to the long-abandoned Sunstone Wing, a place rumored to be haunted by the ghosts of forgotten monarchs. For the elven nobles, it was a crisis of leadership, a terrifying power vacuum. For Ilara, scrubbing a forgotten balustrade, the news was a different kind of terror. The king's stability, however oppressive, was the only thing holding this fragile world together. His fall meant chaos, and for a human mother with nothing to her name, chaos was a death sentence. The proclamation, when it finally came, was delivered with grim finality by the captain of the royal guard. The king's wing was sealed. None were to enter or disturb his cursed rest. Yet, a single servant was required to maintain the antechambers, a silent, invisible presence to manage the dust and shadows. By a cruel twist of fate, or perhaps by the design of some court official who saw her as utterly disposable, the duty fell to Ilara. She was handed a single, heavy iron key, its surface cold and ornate, a stark contrast to her calloused palm. The weight of it felt like a shackle, binding her to the very heart of the kingdom's fear. As her fingers closed around it, she knew her life of quiet suffering was over. She was being pushed out of the shadows and into the immediate orbit of a dying king and his devastating secrets. Before the palace's cold stone became her world, Ilara's life had been woven with the simple, warm threads of a love she thought would last forever. She had married Liam, a stonemason whose hands were as calloused as hers were now, but whose touch was always gentle. They lived in a small cottage at the edge of the human quarter, its garden overflowing with wild roses and the scent of baking bread. He would come home covered in dust, his smile bright enough to chase away the encroaching shadows of the elven city. Their son, Finn, was born from that love, a perfect, vibrant testament to their shared joy. In those fleeting years, Ilara knew a profound sense of belonging, a feeling of being seen and cherished for exactly who she was. The world was small, contained within the walls of their home, but it was whole, and it was hers. It was a life she never imagined she would have to survive without. The tragedy that shattered her world was as sudden and senseless as a lightning strike from a clear sky. Liam had been working on the outer wall fortifications, a project commissioned by the elven lords, when a carelessly secured block of marble gave way. He was gone in an instant, crushed beneath the very stone he had been shaping with such care. The elves offered no compensation, only a clipped, formal apology that felt more like an indictment of human fragility. Ilara was left with nothing but the ghost of his laughter in her empty cottage, and a son who was too young to understand why his father wasn't coming home. The grief was a physical weight, a suffocating pressure in her chest that made it impossible to breathe. The warmth of her life had been extinguished, leaving behind a cold, biting ash that settled over everything she touched. Liam's death plunged them not just into grief, but into crippling debt. The tools he owned were on loan, the cottage's rent was suddenly an insurmountable mountain, and the meager savings they had accumulated vanished within weeks. Desperation became a constant, gnawing companion. Ilara sold her wedding ring, then her mother's locket, each sacrifice a small piece of her soul, chipped away. Finally, with no other options, she presented herself at the gates of Silverwood Palace, begging for any work, no matter how menial. She was given a bucket and a brush, assigned to the most forgotten corners of the vast estate. The palace offered a pittance of a wage and a cot in the dampest part of the servants' quarters, but it was a roof over Finn's head. It was survival, but it came at the cost of her dignity, forcing her into the heart of a world that had taken everything from her. Her deepest wound wasn't the poverty or the back-breaking labor, it was the profound and soul-crushing invisibility. To the Fae, she was less than a ghost. They looked through her, their conversations flowing around her as if she were a piece of furniture. Her grief was an inconvenient human emotion, her existence a necessary but distasteful part of their pristine environment. This constant, silent rejection carved a hollow space inside her, a place where her self-worth had once lived. She learned to make herself smaller, to muffle her footsteps, to lower her eyes, all to avoid the sting of their casual contempt. The woman who had once been a cherished wife and mother was buried beneath layers of shame and silence. She was a tool, a function, and the beautiful, cruel elves of Silverwood never let her forget it. This crushing weight of responsibility for Finn was the only thing that kept her from succumbing to despair. He was the anchor in her storm-tossed life, his small hand in hers, a tangible reason to keep fighting. Every scrap of food she saved, every moment of rest she stole, was for him. Her greatest fear was not her own suffering, but the thought of the world's cruelty turning on him. She saw the way some of the younger elves looked at him, a half-wild human child in their sacred halls, and a fierce, protective fire would ignite in her chest. This love was her shield and her burden. It left no room for her own needs, her own dreams, or her own healing. She was a mother first and foremost, a role that demanded every ounce of her strength, leaving nothing left for the woman named Ilara. The idea of romance, of opening her heart to another, was a fantasy as distant and unattainable as the stars in the elven sky. Her heart was a locked room, the key buried with Liam. She couldn't imagine betraying his memory by allowing another to take his place. More than that, her time in the palace had taught her a bitter lesson. Vulnerability was a weakness, and trust was a currency she could not afford to spend. The powerful fae who moved through these halls were beautiful predators, and any kindness they might show, a human servant would surely have a hidden, dangerous price. Love required a hope she no longer possessed and a sense of self she had long since lost. Survival was a full-time occupation, and it did not allow for the reckless indulgence of the heart. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of these old pains as she scrubbed a grimy section of flooring in a deserted service tunnel, her knuckles raw and red. Suddenly, a pair of immaculate silver-chased boots stopped directly in her line of sight, blocking the dim light. Ilara froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. She slowly looked up, her gaze traveling up the severe, perfectly tailored uniform of a royal guard. It was Captain Vorian, his face a mask of stern indifference. He did not offer a greeting or an explanation. His voice was cold and clipped, a command, not a request. "You will come with me." Now, panic seized her. She was being summoned, dragged from the anonymity of the lower levels. Her mind raced with terrifying possibilities. Had she broken some obscure rule? Was Finn in trouble? She had no choice but to drop her rag into the grimy water and follow, her worn shoes echoing behind his resolute steps as he led her toward the forbidden Sunstone Wing. The Sunstone Wing was a tomb of gilded memories, dust motes dancing like ghosts in the slivers of moonlight piercing through grimy, ornate windows. Here, upon a vast bed carved from the heartwood of a petrified star tree, lay King Theron. He was sculpted from legend, his face a study in severe, timeless beauty, even in supposed unconsciousness. High cheekbones cast sharp shadows, a strong jaw held the memory of command, and his silver hair, long and unbound, pooled around his head like a halo of liquid moonlight. To any observer, he was the picture of a fallen deity, majestic and tragic. But beneath the still, controlled exterior, a storm raged. His body was a battlefield, and the stillness was not peace, but the terrifying calm at the eye of a hurricane, a fragile truce in an unwinnable war against the darkness coiling around his very soul. Theron's reign was built on a foundation of unshakable strength, an image he had meticulously cultivated over centuries. Now, that foundation was cracking under immense pressure. The Elven High Council, a viper's nest of ancient families and festering ambitions, saw his illness as an opportunity to reclaim power they felt was their birthright. His betrothed, Lady Lyra, circled his throne like a patient predator, her concern a thin veil for her own insatiable desire for the crown. Beyond their borders, rival kingdoms watched and waited, smelling the decay on the wind. This feigned slumber was his most desperate gambit, a single, sharp stone cast into the placid waters of his court to see which ripples would reveal the monsters lurking beneath. It was a test of loyalty, a purge of treason, but it left him utterly exposed, a king playing dead while wolves gathered at his door. His true vulnerability was not political, but primal. The Shadow Blight was more than a curse. It was a sentient hunger, a parasitic entity woven into his bloodline that fed on his magic and his will. It whispered to him in the deep of night, showing him visions of unbridled rage, of a feral beast tearing through his own pristine halls, destroying everything he had sworn to protect. Every day was a battle of attrition, a silent, agonizing war to keep the monster caged. His greatest fear was not death, but a far worse fate, losing himself completely to the blight, becoming a mindless vessel of destruction, his legacy reduced to ash and ruin. He was a king chained to a beast, and with each passing season, the chains grew weaker, the beast stronger, and his hope for salvation dwindled to a dying ember. An ancient, fragmented prophecy was his only solace and his greatest torment. It spoke of a mortal voice carrying the starlight hymn, a melody with the power to soothe the primal rage of the blight and restore the balance between his fey nature and the darkness within. For decades, he had searched, deploying his most trusted agents to every corner of the known world. He had listened to every renowned singer, every village bard, every whispered lullaby, but the hymn remained elusive. The search had yielded nothing but disappointment, each failure another turn of the key in his internal prison. He was beginning to believe the prophecy was a cruel jest, a sliver of false hope designed to make his inevitable descent into madness all the more painful. The weight of his kingdom and the fate of his own soul rested on finding a song he was no longer sure even existed. Then, through the suffocating fog of his meditative trance, he heard it. It wasn't a performance. It was a whisper, a thread of sound, so pure and gentle it cut through the internal clamor of the blight like a shard of light through obsidian. It was Elara. Her lullaby, a forgotten human melody, was the starlight hymn. The raw, untamed magic in her voice washed over him, not with force, but with an impossible gentleness, silencing the snarling beast in his soul for the first time in his memory. The relief was so profound it was paralyzing, a sudden, shocking silence after centuries of noise. He was frozen, not by curse or by magic, but by the earth-shattering realization that his salvation, the key to his survival and the future of his kingdom, lay in the hands of a human servant he had never even noticed. He could not move, could not reveal his deception, not yet. The court was watching, and any sign of recovery would ruin his gambit, but he could not let her leave. He couldn't risk losing the only cure he had ever found. As she turned to go, her quiet footsteps echoing his own frantic thoughts, Theron focused the last dregs of his controlled power. He reached out with his mind, not to her, but to the one man whose loyalty was absolute. He projected a single, undeniable command into the consciousness of Captain Vorion, a mental order that would feel like the captain's own instinct. It was a desperate, silent plea that would manifest as a cold, hard command. Find the human servant, bring her to me, now. He needed her back, but for Elara, the summons would feel like a judgment, a terrifying call to answer for a crime she didn't even know she had committed. Captain Vorion led her through a labyrinth of silent, opulent corridors, until they reached the heavy, carved doors of the king's private wing. He opened one, gestured for her to enter, and then closed it behind her with a soft, final click that echoed like a cell door locking. The air inside was still and heavy, scented with dried herbs and old magic. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She expected to see the king lying in his cursed slumber, a tragic figure surrounded by healers. Instead, he was sitting on the edge of the massive bed, very much awake. His silver hair was unbound, and he wore a simple tunic of dark silk. Yet his presence was so immense, so overwhelmingly powerful, it seemed to consume all the light and air in the room. His eyes, the color of a winter storm, were fixed on her, and in their depths she saw not sleep, but a terrifying, predatory stillness. He did not speak for a long moment, his silence a weapon that methodically stripped away her composure. When his voice finally came, it wasn't the thunderous command she had imagined, but a low, resonant sound that vibrated through the floor and up into her very soul. "The song," he said, the two words cutting through the tension with surgical precision. "The one you were humming. Where did you learn it?" The question was so unexpected it shattered her fear, replacing it with a profound confusion. She looked down at her hands, twisting the rough fabric of her apron. It was "It was my mother's," she stammered, her voice a reedy whisper. "A lullaby, just a forgotten human song to soothe a child." He watched her, his gaze unwavering, and for the first time since Liam's death, Ilara felt truly seen, not as a servant or a fixture, but as a person. And the sensation was as terrifying as it was intoxicating. Theron rose from the bed, his movements fluid and deliberate, the contained grace of a creature who knew its own lethal power. He didn't raise his voice or make any threatening gestures, but his sheer presence was a form of domination. He began to speak of his kingdom, his voice a cold, clear current of authority. He spoke of the decay, not just in the land, but in the loyalty of his court. He described the Elven High Council as a nest of patient vipers, ancient families who saw his reign as a temporary inconvenience and his current illness as the perfect opportunity to strike. He painted a grim portrait of a monarch besieged from within, a king whose every perceived weakness was a drop of blood in waters filled with sharks. He was showing her the pieces of the board, making her understand that his life was a constant, ruthless game of strategy and survival. He paused before a tall, arched window that looked out upon the withering palace gardens, a mirror of his own internal blight. "This affliction," he began, his voice dropping, taking on a raw, vulnerable edge that startled her. "It is a poison in my bloodline, a shadow that drains my strength and, with it, my authority." He turned back to face her, and the mask of the eternal king was gone, replaced by the tormented expression of a man chained to a terrible fate. "While your song, the lullaby, for the first time in a century, it quieted the storm inside me. It gave me a moment of clarity, a respite I had forgotten was possible." He took a step closer, his stormy eyes locking onto hers. "I do not understand the nature of your magic, human, but I know that I need it. My kingdom needs it. My very survival depends on it." The world seemed to tilt on its axis as he uttered the next words, each one landing like a physical blow. "Yes, I am proposing a contract, Ilara, a marriage." He let the word hang in the air between them, a shocking, impossible thing. "You will become my queen. You will stand by my side, a constant presence in my life and in my court. In public, you will be my inexplicable choice, a symbol of my will. In private, you will be my anchor. Your voice, your very proximity, will be the shield that holds the worst of this malady at bay." He laid out the terms with the dispassionate clarity of a general outlining a battle plan, offering her a role in a war she never knew was being waged. It was not a proposal of love or even affection. It was a desperate, strategic move from a king with no other options left. He saw the wild panic in her eyes and pressed his advantage, targeting the one vulnerability he knew she possessed. "I am not asking you to do this for a crown you do not want, or a title you do not understand. I am offering you something far more valuable." His gaze was sharp, calculated. "Your son, Finn, he will be granted the title of prince, raised and educated as royalty. He will have the finest tutors, the best guards, and the full protection of my throne. He will never know hunger, fear, or contempt again. Every door will be open to him. I will give him a future of absolute safety and limitless opportunity, a future you could never provide for him, no matter how hard you scrub these floors." He was offering her a gilded cage, but he was also offering her child the world. And he knew it was a price she could not refuse. Ilara's mind was a maelstrom of terror and impossible hope. To be queen was to be a target, a human oddity in a court of ancient, prideful beings who would despise her very existence. She would be trading her quiet, anonymous suffering for a life of public humiliation and constant, treacherous scrutiny. She would be shackled to this cold, powerful, and deeply broken man, her life no longer her own. And yet, the image of Finn, his face bright with laughter, dressed in fine clothes, safe and secure, burned behind her eyes. This king was offering to end the gnawing fear that was her constant companion. He was offering her son's salvation in exchange for her soul. The crushing weight of her maternal love, the force that had driven her for years, made the choice for her. There was no choice at all. She lifted her head, and for the first time, her eyes met his, not with the deference of a servant, but with the defiant strength of a mother protecting her young. A spark of the woman she used to be, the woman who had loved and been loved, flickered to life in the depths of her soul. "I accept," she said, her voice quiet but as solid as stone. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of victory, but she was not finished. "But I have one condition." A flicker of surprise crossed his regal features. "My son will be a prince, and he will be safe. That is your part of the bargain. But you will never, under any circumstances, use my song to soothe him to sleep. His lullabies will come from me, and me alone. That part of his heart and mine will never belong to you." The silence that followed was absolute, the demand of a powerless woman who had just claimed the one thing his power could not touch. The ceremony was not held in a grand hall filled with nobles, but in the sterile silence of the king's private study, a room that felt more like a vault than a place of union. There were no flowers, no music, only the dry scratch of a quill on heavy parchment. The marriage contract lay between them on a polished obsidian desk, its elven script a series of elegant, unforgiving thorns. Ilara stood in a simple, borrowed gown of dark blue, the fabric feeling alien and heavy against her skin. Theron was a statue of silver and shadow beside her, his expression unreadable. He signed his name with a fluid, decisive stroke, his royal seal a splash of crimson wax. Then the quill was passed to her. Her hand trembled as she took it, the ink staining her finger like a drop of poison. This was not a wedding, it was a transaction, the formal signing away of her life, her future, and the ghost of the love she once knew. As she dipped the quill, her mind was not on the powerful king beside her, but on Finn. She saw his small, sleeping face, the way his brow furrowed in dreams, and the hollow look in his eyes when his belly was empty. Every sacrifice she had ever made was for him. But this one felt different, a severing of her very soul. The name she wrote, Ilara Vance, felt like a lie, a name belonging to a woman who had died with her husband. With each letter, she was burying that woman deeper, erecting a monument of royal duty over her grave. The ink dried, sealing the pact. She was no longer a servant, no longer invisible. She was a queen, a cure, a cage for a monster, and a prisoner in a gilded world. The weight of the crown she could not yet see was already crushing her, a phantom ache that promised a lifetime of beautiful, exquisite pain. Theron watched her, his senses unnaturally sharp, attuned to the slight tremor in her hand, the catch in her breath. He felt no triumph, only the cold satisfaction of a general who had secured a vital strategic position. She was the key, the living antidote to the poison in his veins. Yet, as she signed her name, her expression a mask of stoic resolve. He felt an unfamiliar flicker of something other than calculation. It was not pity. He could not afford such a weakness, but a grudging respect for the steel in her spine. This was not a frightened girl, but a woman making a conscious, agonizing sacrifice. He saw the mother in her, the fierce, protective instinct that mirrored the feral possessiveness of the blight within him. He had purchased her loyalty, but he was beginning to suspect that the spirit he was trying to bind was far wilder than he had anticipated. The news of the union spread through the palace, not like a joyful announcement, but like a contagion. In the hallowed chambers of the Elven High Council, Lord Valerius, a noble whose bloodline was as ancient and unyielding as the mountains, shattered a crystal goblet in his hand. The marriage was an abomination, an insult to centuries of tradition and purity. He saw it as a sign of the king's madness, a symptom of the very weakness he and his allies had been waiting to exploit. To them, Ilara was not a queen, but a human pestilence, a commoner elevated to a station she could only defile. Valerius's shock quickly cooled into a venomous resolve. The king had given them the perfect weapon. They would not need to stage a coup. They would simply watch as this inexplicable, vulgar union eroded Theron's authority from within. And then they would pick up the pieces. Beyond the palace walls, the reaction was a maelstrom of confusion and disbelief. For the elven populace, their eternal king marrying a mortal, a human servant no less, was a concept so alien it bordered on blasphemy. Whispers turned to scorn, their reverence for the throne tainted by a deep, instinctual revulsion. For the small, oppressed human community, the news was a terrifying miracle, one of their own. A widow they knew from the market east was now queen. It sparked a dangerous, fragile hope in some, a feeling that they might finally be seen. In others, it created a profound fear. They knew the cruelty of the Fae, and they feared the backlash that would inevitably fall upon them all when this royal fancy soured. Ilara had not just become a queen, she had become a symbol, a lightning rod for the hopes and hatred of an entire kingdom. Captain Vorian escorted them from the study to the royal apartments, a journey that felt miles long. Every guard they passed, every courtier who scurried out of their path, stared. The elven gazes were like shards of ice, sharp with contempt and morbid curiosity. Ilara kept her eyes fixed on the marble floor, feeling the heat of their judgment brand her skin. She had never felt more exposed, more fragile. Then she felt a subtle shift beside her. Theron had moved, his body now positioned just slightly ahead of hers, his broad shoulders obscuring her from the direct line of sight of a particularly sneering group of nobles. It was not a gesture of kindness, she told herself, but one of ownership. He was protecting his asset, his cure, but as his sleeve brushed against her arm, a strange, unwelcome warmth spread through her, a fleeting sense of being shielded that she hadn't felt since Liam's death. The royal bedchamber was a universe of cold splendor. The ceiling was a dome of enchanted glass, showing a perpetual twilight sky, constellations of captured starlight drifting slowly across it. The bed was a vast continent of dark wood and silk sheets the color of ash, large enough to feel like an ocean separating two islands. The air was scented with moon petal and winter jasmine, a fragrance so cloying and perfect it made her lungs ache for the simple smell of earth and rain. This room was not a home. It was a museum exhibit, a testament to a power and wealth she could never comprehend. As the heavy doors closed behind them, leaving them in absolute silence, the reality of her new life crashed down upon her. She was utterly alone, with the most powerful and dangerous being she had ever known, in a cage so beautiful she might forget she was trapped. Theron turned to her, the false stars of the ceiling casting shifting patterns of light across his severe features. "This is a contract," he began, his voice low and devoid of warmth. "But it must be a convincing performance. The court will be watching our every interaction for any sign of weakness, any hint of artifice. They must believe this is a union of my choosing." He took a step closer, his presence commanding the space between them, making the vast room feel small and suffocating. "Oh, we will dine together. We will walk the gardens together, and in public you will permit me to show some affection." He said the word as if it were a foreign term he had just learned. He slowly raised his hand, his long, elegant fingers reaching for her. Ilara flinched, her body tensing for a blow, a command, anything but the gentleness that was to come. His fingers brushed her cheek, his touch as cold as the marble floors she used to scrub. It was a calculated gesture, a clinical demonstration for the role she was now to play. "A touch like this," he murmured, his stormy eyes fixed on hers, "a simple sign of possession." He leaned in, his silver hair falling around them like a curtain, shutting out the rest of the world. "And this," he whispered, his lips hovering just above hers, "is to quell any doubt." He closed the distance, his mouth claiming hers in what was meant to be a chaste, symbolic kiss. But the moment their lips met, a jolt of raw energy, potent and untamed, arced between them. It was not gentle, it was a cataclysm. The starlight hymn was not just in her voice, it was in her very essence, a life force that slammed into the cold, ancient core of his being. He did not pull away. Instead, a low growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that was not entirely his own, and his hand tangled in her hair, his grip tightening. The kiss deepened, transformed from a calculated act into something primal, a desperate, consuming hunger. He was not kissing his queen. He was a dying man, drinking from the only source of life in a barren desert. Ilara was frozen, her mind blank with shock, her body alight with a terrifying fire. She felt the profound, chilling cold of his magic, but beneath it, she felt the ravenous heat of the blight, a starved beast that recognized her as its only solace. When he finally tore himself away, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his eyes were wide with a dawning horror. They both understood in that shattering, silent moment, this was not a contract, it was a bond, elemental and unbreakable, and the monster he was trying to contain had just tasted its salvation. The morning after the kiss was a landscape of deafening silence. The vast royal bedchamber, which had felt like a battlefield the night before, was now a neutral, tension-filled territory. They moved around each other with a new, stilted awareness, two celestial bodies knocked from their orbits, now circling one another in a strange and unpredictable gravity. Ilara could still feel the phantom pressure of his lips, the chilling cold of his magic, and the terrifying, ravenous heat that lay beneath it. He had not touched her again. He had retreated behind his mask of regal indifference, but she could see the cracks. His gaze would occasionally catch hers, and in those fleeting moments she saw not a king assessing his cure, but a man staring at the source of his greatest fear and his only hope. The performance had ended, and the terrifying reality of their bond had just begun. Their days settled into a rigid, orchestrated routine, a play performed for an unseen audience of courtiers and spies. They took their meals together in a grand dining hall, the table a long, polished expanse of darkwood that felt more like a chasm between them. Ilara struggled with the dizzying array of silver cutlery, her calloused hands fumbling with instruments of a life she never imagined. Theron would watch her, his expression unreadable, occasionally offering a quiet, clipped correction on a point of etiquette. He was teaching her how to be a queen, but it felt more like he was training an animal to perform a series of complex tricks. Yet, in these moments of instruction, his focus on her was absolute, his stormy eyes missing nothing. She was the center of his world, not out of affection, but out of a desperate, all-consuming necessity. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the suffocating opulence, Ilara found her way to the royal library, a towering cathedral of books that smelled of old paper and dust. She ran her fingers over the leather-bound elven tomes, their script alien and unreadable. Tucked away on a low shelf, she found a small, worn book of human fairy tales, a relic from some long-forgotten era. She was tracing the faded illustration of a knight and a peasant girl when Theron's shadow fell over her. He looked down at the simple book, a faint, almost imperceptible line of curiosity on his face. "Human stories," he observed, his voice a low rumble. "They always end in tragedy or impossible fortune." Ilara met his gaze, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Sometimes they end in survival," she replied quietly, "and that is its own kind of fortune." For the first time, a genuine, fleeting smile touched his lips. The court, however, was not content to let them find any peace. During a formal reception in the grand hall of Whispering Fountains, Elara was left alone for a moment while Theron conferred with his captain. It was then that the wolves closed in. Lady Lyra, Theron's spurned betrothed, approached with a cruel smile, flanked by the sneering Lord Valerius. "Tell me, little human," Lyra began, her voice dripping with venom but loud enough for those nearby to hear, "does the dirt from your old life wash off easily, or does our king now sleep in a bed that smells of cinders and poverty?" The surrounding nobles tittered, their laughter like the chipping of ice. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, the familiar, crushing weight of her invisibility returning tenfold. She was a stain on their perfect world, and they would never let her forget it. Before she could even form a response, a cold presence enveloped them. Theron had returned, his movements utterly silent. He did not look at Lyra or Valerius. Instead, he placed his hand on the small of Elara's back, a gesture of undeniable possession that sent a jolt through her. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the murmuring hall like a blade of Arctic ice. "The Queen finds your grasp of courtly conversation lacking, Lady Lyra." His gaze finally shifted to her, and the warmth of the room seemed to plummet. "Perhaps you should retire before you embarrass yourself further." It was a dismissal, cold and absolute. Lyra's face paled, and she curtsied stiffly before making a hasty retreat, the other nobles scattering like startled birds. He had shielded her, but the touch on her back felt more like a brand than a comfort. The humiliation escalated during a meeting of the Elven High Council, to which Elara was now required to attend. She sat on a smaller, unadorned throne beside Theron, a silent prop in his political theatre. Lord Valerius rose, his face a mask of false deference. "Your Majesty, we rejoice in your newfound vitality," he began, his eyes fixed on Elara. "But the Council has concerns. The royal bloodline is the heart of our kingdom's magic. We must ask, what assurances do we have that this dilution will not prove catastrophic for us all?" He was calling her a poison, a human impurity that threatened to contaminate their very existence. The insult was clear, a direct challenge to Theron's judgment and authority, using her as the weapon. The air grew thick with tension, every lord in the chamber waiting to see how the king would respond to such a brazen attack. Theron remained still for a long, agonizing moment, letting the insult hang in the air. Then he rose slowly from his throne, his full height and power seeming to diminish everyone else in the room. His voice was a low, dangerous whisper that carried to every corner of the chamber. "Lord Valerius," he said, the name itself sounding like a curse, "you are correct. The royal bloodline is the heart of this kingdom, and the woman beside me is now part of that bloodline. She is your queen." He took a step forward, his eyes blazing with a cold, silver fire. "Her word is my word, her authority is my authority, and any who dare to question her place are questioning my own. Let me make this clear to all of you. The next person who offers her an insult will be answering for treason." The silence was absolute, shattered only by the sound of Valerius's sharp, terrified intake of breath. Back in the safety of their chambers, the weight of the confrontation settled upon Elara. He hadn't just dismissed an insult. He had declared her an extension of his own being in front of the most powerful elves in the kingdom. He had risked a political schism to defend her honor. She stood by the window, her reflection a pale ghost against the darkening sky, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was not part of the contract. The agreement was for her proximity, her voice, a shield for his private war. This public defense was something else entirely, something far more personal and dangerous. A terrifying, fragile question began to bloom in the desolate garden of her heart. Were they only pretending, or had the performance begun to bleed into a reality neither of them was prepared for? Theron watched her from across the room, the feral rage he had felt in the council chamber slowly receding, leaving a disquieting stillness in its wake. The blight had surged at Valerius's words, a primal instinct to protect what was his. But the anger had felt more than just possessive. It had been personal. He had seen the flicker of pain in Ilara's eyes, the way she had tried to make herself smaller on her throne. And it had ignited a fury in him that was entirely his own. This was a catastrophic complication. His control was predicated on emotional distance, on seeing her as a tool, a cure. But in that moment, he had seen a woman being wounded, and his reaction had been that of a man, not a strategist. He was losing his objectivity, and for a king chained to a monster, losing control was a death sentence. Later that evening, the tension between them had softened into a fragile, unspoken truce. He found her on a stone balcony, a thin shawl wrapped around her shoulders, shivering slightly in the cool night air. The stars of the enchanted ceiling inside were beautiful, but they were a lie. She preferred the real, distant stars of the mortal world. Without a word, Theron disappeared into the chamber and returned with a heavy cloak lined with silver fox fur, the material impossibly soft and warm. He draped it over her shoulders himself, his fingers brushing the nape of her neck. The touch was brief, fleeting, but it was a gesture of pure, uncalculated care. It was a silent apology and a confession, an admission that the lines of their contract had been irrevocably blurred. The warmth of the cloak felt more intimate than any kiss. It was a simple, human gesture from a being who was anything but. Ilara turned to face him, the fur soft against her cheek, her heart aching with a feeling she had sworn she would never feel again. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sighing of the wind. "In the council chamber. You didn't have to do that. You put your own rule at risk for me." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant, shadowed peaks of the mountains. "They were testing the strength of the throne," he said, his voice a low evasion. "I merely showed it to them." But Ilara saw the truth in the tight line of his jaw, in the way he refused to meet her eyes. It wasn't just the throne he was protecting. Their fragile moment was shattered by the sharp, urgent knock on the chamber door. A royal herald entered, his face pale and grim, bowing low before the king. He carried a heavy, rolled scroll, tied with the crimson ribbon of the High Council. Theron took it, his expression hardening as he broke the wax seal. He read the elven script, his face becoming a mask of cold fury. "Valerius!" he growled, the name a venomous hiss. He looked at Ilara, and she saw the corner into which they had been backed. "The council has invoked the ancient rite of celestial union," he explained, his voice tight. "A public ceremony, deeply magical, designed to bless the royal marriage and test its legitimacy. They are demanding proof that our bond is real, not just in law, but in spirit and flesh." The news of the rite of celestial union fell upon Ilara not as a royal decree, but as the cold, final clang of a prison gate. The fragile trust that had begun to sprout between them withered in an instant, replaced by the bitter frost of betrayal. In the suffocating silence of their chambers, she finally turned on him, her voice not loud, but honed to a razor's edge of pain. "Was this always your plan?" she asked, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Was every gentle word, every public defense, just another scene in this elaborate play? You weren't protecting me. You were grooming your sacrifice for the altar. You have paraded me before your court, forced me to endure their scorn, all while knowing you were leading me to a magical inquisition that could tear me apart. You didn't just buy my life, Theron. You put a price on my very soul." Theron's regal composure fractured, the mask of the eternal king cracking to reveal the desperate man beneath. He couldn't meet her accusing gaze, instead turning to the window as if the dying gardens offered some solace. "It was not a lie," he stated, his voice raw with a torment she had never heard before. "It was a desperate hope. The prophecy, it doesn't just say your voice can soothe the blight. It says only a true bond, a union of spirit, can sever its hold on my bloodline forever. He finally faced her, his stormy eyes filled with a terrifying vulnerability. The rite of celestial union is not a test of love, Elara. It is a forging. It will either bind our souls together with an unbreakable magic, or it will recognize the deception, and the resulting magical backlash will consume you. I brought you here hoping your presence alone would be enough, but the council has forced my hand. They have turned my last hope into a death sentence. The truth was a far greater horror than the lie. He hadn't just used her. He had gambled with her existence on a fragmented prophecy. The choice before her was impossible, a cruel twist of fate that made her previous hardships seem like a distant dream. She could refuse to participate in the rite, exposing him as a fraud and a weakling, and in doing so, will bring the wrath of the entire Elven High Council down upon them both, surely sealing a terrible fate for Finn. Or she could walk into that chamber, stand before a magical artifact that judged the truth of her heart, and pretend to feel a bond so profound it could fool the very fabric of creation. Her son's future was held in one hand, and her own annihilation in the other. It was the ultimate test of a mother's love, demanding a sacrifice not of dignity or freedom, but of her very being. He saw the despair in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the impossible weight of his confession, and something inside him finally broke. He crossed the room in 2 long strides, stopping just before her, his hands hovering in the space between them as if afraid to touch her. "This was not supposed to be your burden," he choked out, the words ripped from a place of ancient agony. "For centuries, I have fought this alone. The isolation, the fear of the beast I carry, it is a cold, endless night." He looked at her then, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, stripping away all pretense. "When Lord Valerius insulted you, the rage I felt was not the blight. It was mine. It was the fury of a man watching them harm the only light that has pierced my darkness in 1,000 years. My need for you is no longer just a matter of survival. It has become the one true thing in my cursed life." His words were not a declaration of love, but something far more raw and desperate, a confession of his soul's deepest truth. The anger in Ilara's heart did not vanish, but it was eclipsed by a wave of profound, aching empathy. She saw him not as a king, not as her captor, but as a fellow prisoner, chained to a fate as cruel as her own. Slowly, she reached out and laid her hand on his arm. The fabric of his tunic was cool, but beneath it, she could feel the frantic, human-like beat of his heart. "You are not fighting alone anymore," she whispered, the words a vow that sealed their shared destiny more than any marriage contract ever could. In that moment, the performance ended. They would face the rite not as a king and his cure, but as 2 souls bound by a shared desperation, clinging to the terrifying, impossible hope that their fragile connection was real enough to save them both. The day of the rite dawned cold and grey, the sky a mirror of the kingdom's anxious heart. The great sept was a sea of silent, watching faces, every noble and courtier in Silverwood gathered to witness the judgment. Elara walked beside Theron down the long marble aisle, her gown of starlight silver feeling less like a dress and more like a suit of armor. The air was electric, thick with ancient magic and the palpable weight of 1,000 years of tradition. At the heart of the sept, before the high priest, pulsed the heartstone, a massive, living crystal that glowed with a soft, internal light, seeming to breathe with the rhythm of the world. All eyes were on them as they ascended the dais. The silence deepened, becoming absolute. Then the high priest raised his arms, his voice echoing through the hallowed space. "He let the rite of celestial union commence. Let the bond of king and queen be laid bare for the heartstone to judge." They placed their hands upon the cold, smooth surface of the Heartstone. A wave of ancient, dispassionate magic washed over Ilara, probing, searching, judging. It felt like being submerged in an icy sea, every fear and insecurity of her past laid bare for this silent, powerful entity. The whispers of the court faded into a dull roar in her ears. She could feel their collective disdain, a palpable force pressing in on her. She risked a glance at Theron. In his eyes, she saw not the calculating monarch who had trapped her, but a man facing his own execution, his pride stripped away, leaving only a raw, terrifying vulnerability. In that instant, she knew she could not pretend. Their survival could not be built on a lie. Whatever happened next, it would be born from the fragile, terrifying truth that had grown between them in the shadows of the palace. Before the high priest could speak the words of judgment, Theron pulled his hand from the stone. The sudden movement sent a collective gasp through the sept. He turned, not to the priest or the artifact, but to the sea of stunned elven faces, his gaze sweeping over the High Council with an intensity that silenced all whispers. "You came here for a test of legitimacy," his voice boomed. "Clear and resonant, stripped of all artifice. Then you shall have the truth." He took a breath, a king preparing to unmake himself. "For centuries, I have been afflicted by the shadow blight, a curse that has poisoned my blood and withered our lands. I have ruled from a throne of secrets and fear, growing weaker with each passing year." He then looked directly at Lord Valerius. "You were right to question my strength, but you were wrong about its source." He took Ilara's hand, his grip firm and unwavering, a silent declaration before the world. "The ancient prophecies spoke of a starlight hymn, a mortal voice that could soothe the beast within me," Theron continued, his voice ringing with a power that had nothing to do with his crown. "This marriage began as a desperate contract to secure that cure. I brought this woman to my side not as a queen, but as a shield." He turned his gaze to Ilara, and the entire court seemed to disappear, leaving only the two of them in a universe of their own making. But I was the one who was blind. Her song did not just quiet a monster. Her courage, her resilience, her profound capacity for love in a world that showed her none. It reminded the man how to be stronger than the beast. He looked back at the council, his voice thick with emotion. "I no longer care about your traditions or your bloodlines. I love her, and that is the only truth that matters." As the last word of his confession echoed through the hall, the Heartstone behind them erupted in a blinding cascade of golden light. It was not the violent explosion of a failed ritual, but a joyous, overwhelming affirmation. The magic surged not into them, but from them. A testament to a bond that transcended contracts and prophecies. The Starlight Hymn was not a melody to be sung. It was the resonance of two souls, one mortal and one fey, finding their perfect harmony. The light poured into Theron, a purifying fire that incinerated the last vestiges of the shadow blight, not by force, but by replacing the darkness with an even greater power. The prophecy had been incomplete. It was not her voice that would save him, but their love, freely given and publicly declared, that would save them all. In the sacred silence that followed, the golden light softened, leaving the great sept bathed in a warm, gentle glow. Lord Valerius stood frozen, his face a mask of utter shock, his political machinations turned to dust by a power he could never have conceived. Every noble in the room was on their feet, not in protest, but in stunned, reverent awe. The air itself felt different, cleansed and vibrant with a renewed magic. Theron turned to Ilara, his stormy eyes now as clear and bright as a winter sky after a storm, the centuries of pain and torment washed away. He cupped her face in his hands, his touch no longer cold but filled with a radiant warmth. "My queen," he whispered, his voice breaking with 1,000 years of unshed emotion, before he kissed her, sealing their future not with a contract, but with a promise that would echo for eternity. Months later, The once withering gardens of Silverwood bloomed with a riot of impossible color, a testament to the land's healing. Ilara stood on a sun-drenched balcony, her hand resting on the gentle curve of her belly, a quiet promise of a new beginning for their bloodline. Theron came to stand behind her, his arms wrapping around her in a familiar, comforting embrace. They watched as Finn, now a prince in both title and spirit, chased after glowing sprites in the grass below, his laughter the new anthem of the palace. Their story had become a legend, a whispered truth that a king's greatest strength was not his power, but the courage to love. They had found their safety not in a different world, but in the one they had remade together. If their journey to find light in the darkness has touched your heart, please honor their tale by liking this video, commenting with your favorite moment, and subscribing to our channel for more stories of epic love.